Michael in Columbus, Ohio, listening on Ave Maria Radio. You are next, Michael. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Oh, hi, Jim. This is my first time talking to you. Hello. Hey, so I'm from Ghana, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I'm living here in Columbus, Ohio. And so I've been wondering, okay, this is just weird. So I've been wondering that, okay, God created man and woman and all the good stuff. And I'm wondering is there any history in the Bible somewhere that states something about Africa, especially the dark color, as to their creation? Because we don't have anything that states anything how they came to be. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, Adam and Eve, Israelites, and it's all about it's basically like light skin. So I'm trying to figure out. I know this is going to be a very weird question for you, but I'm sorry. I just have to know.
Okay. This is not weird for Jimmy.
Anything that is there anything in the Bible that states or has any record of the creation of blacks or how they came to be, and even if not in the Bible, like in theology, something that you guys have that we don't know that you can state on, okay, how they came to be and their color and stuff like that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there are a few things to say here, and this is a very interesting question, and we don't have a lot of time before the break, so I'm going to need to finish this after the break.
Okay.
But the first thing to say is, well, we don't have any indication that Adam and Eve were white. They're often pictured that way in artwork, but we don't have any indication of what their skin tone would have been. So that's completely unknown. In terms of the different skin-complected races in the Bible, we do have mention, of black people, folks from sub-Saharan Africa. Moses, in fact, was married to a woman from Ethiopia, which in biblical times was known as Cush. And after his first wife, who was from the Middle East, after she died, he married a Cushite woman. And in fact, there is a very interesting story where Moses' brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam, start complaining about Moses' wife. And it seems that Miriam took the lead in complaining about Moses' Cushite wife. And to punish her for the disrespect she was showing, God gave her leprosy temporarily. And it says in the text, she was white as snow. So it's kind of like God saying, you got a problem with the Cushite wife? You want white? I got your white right here. and she becomes leprous. So this is an indication that that God doesn't care about your skin color. We're all equal to him. In terms of the question of how did this come about, it's something that we're not told in any direct way. The closest that we come to an explanation is found in early Genesis after the flood. After the flood, Noah has, the three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so the flood ends in chapter 9 of Genesis. And then in chapters 10 and 11, we have the diffusion of the human race, the repopulation of the earth in the wake of the flood. And as part of that, we have something called the Table of Nations, which we'll talk about more after the break.
Live. Michael on the line in Columbus, Ohio, originally from Ghana, asking about how race is handled in the Bible, particularly if there's anything there about where darker-skinned people come from. And I said African-American people in the Bible. No, that is not correct. There are African people in the Bible, sub-Saharan African people in the Bible, but no Americans of any kind in the Bible. Michael, are you still with us?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
All right. And
okay.
Jimmy's in the midst of his answer.
So after the flood, Noah's family spreads out and starts to repopulate the earth. And in Genesis chapter 10, we have a passage known as the Table of Nations. And what it is essentially a collection of different ethnic groups that are attributed to, here's how they descend from Noah. So you have Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and you have this group of about 70 different national ethnic groups, and it tries to relate them in terms of a genealogy linking them to Noah. And among them is Cush. Cush, as I said, is the biblical name for Ethiopia, and Cush is said to be a descendant of Ham. So you got the three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Cush is a descendant of Ham. But we have to be a little careful here, because this passage occurs in the prehistory. This is before Abraham. It's before the Israelites had historical records. And it's pretty clear that when you study the Table of Nations carefully, that it's not meant to be taken as a literal biological genealogy. And that's something that can be confusing to us today, because when we think of genealogies, we think of them as being biological. You know, if you have a father and a son in a genealogy cyclet, usually the father is the biological father of the son, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Is that always the case, though?
Well,
can you ever think of a case where a father in a genealogy is not the biological father of his son that's listed in the genealogy?
I have one that comes to mind, Jimmy, and that would be Joseph as the father of Jesus.
Okay, so that's a foster fatherhood situation.
Yeah.
There are others, and I wasn't going to the Bible at that point.
Oh,
Just
okay.
like
All right.
Today, in a genealogy, you may have a family genealogy, but somebody may have been adopted.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And you could adopt someone as your son, and in that case, they go into the genealogy for the family, even though they're not your biological offspring. Well, the same thing was true in ancient Israelite society. Because they were a patriarchal society, they were organized along genealogical lines. So if you wanted to, say, join Israel, you needed to fit into the family structure somehow. It wouldn't make sense. So you're an Israelite. Well, which one of the 12 tribes do you belong to? None of them. Well, then how are you an Israelite? So what they would do is they would posthumously adopt you into one of the tribes. So, for example, Caleb, we're told he's actually not an Israelite by origin, but he gets adopted into the tribe of Judah. And so Judah had died centuries earlier, but now Caleb is a descendant of Judah by adoption. And this is how, and it's not just the Israelites who would do this. Arab tribes like Bedouins do this today. If you marry into a family, you need to be put into the genealogy, and they say you have been genealogized. So you do this posthumous adoption to give you an ancestor within the group. Well, so we know this is how their genealogies worked, and really when you study the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, that's what they're doing here. They're creating a legal genealogy to relate all of these different cultural groups to each other. It's not meant to be literal and biological. And you can see that, for example, in terms of our skin tone question by looking at the other sons of Ham. So we're told, this is Genesis 10:6, the sons of Ham are Cush, so that's Ethiopia, that's quite dark skin. Egypt, okay, not as dark skin. Egyptians have a kind of middle tone skin that's dominant in Egypt. They're not as light as Europeans, but they're not as dark as sub-Saharan Africans. Put, that's Libya, and Libyans tend to be on the lighter side of things. And Canaan. And Canaanites also tend to be on the lighter side of things. So right there in the sons of Ham, you've got several different skin tones. So this is not a literal biological genealogy. It's a legal genealogy that relates these groups to each other, principally based on their languages. scholars have looked at it and said, okay, these groups tend to fall into language groups rather than biological groups. So how did racial diversity develop in the world? Well, the Bible doesn't really tell us, and so that means it's a matter of science. We need to look to science for the answer. Well, according to the current best science, the human race first developed in Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa. And because of the climatic conditions and all the direct sunlight coming down on Africa, the human race originally appears to have been black, because you need that extra melanin in your skin. Melanin is the pigment in our skin that protects us from the sun. It's kind of like natural suntan lotion or natural sunscreen. And Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, got a lot of direct sunlight because of the equator. And so people there developed to have darker colored skin to protect them from the sun. But then several tens of thousands of years ago, the human race started to migrate out of Africa. At least our most immediate ancestors, Homo sapiens, did. Others, like Homo neanderthal, had left earlier. But some Homo sapiens ended up in very northern climates, like my ancestors ended up in northern Europe. And in northern Europe, the sun does not strike at the same angle. So you're not getting as intense sunlight. And as a result of that, since our skin makes vitamin D for us, which is a very essential hormone, our skin makes vitamin D for us from sunlight. My ancestors were not making enough vitamin D because the melanin in their skin was blocking the sunlight that they needed to make vitamin D. And so over the course of time, they started to lose all of that extra melanin. Their ancestors in Africa had needed it to protect them from the sun. But in Northern Europe, they needed to lose it so they could get enough sunlight into their skin to make the vitamin D that they needed. And so that's how we ended up with different racial groups. It was a slow process over a long period of time, but it was based on the climatic conditions where people were living and what they needed, whether they needed protection from really intense sunlight or whether they needed to have lighter skin so they could get more sunlight and make the vitamin D they needed.
Michael, does that satisfy what you were looking for?
Yes, you are so good. Thank you so much. God bless you. This is so awesome. Oh, thank you so much. And hopefully other people have heard it, so that will really ease a lot of mindset, because mostly we don't get that education like this, and this is awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's great to hear from you, and always great to hear from someone from Africa. It's really cool. You're from Ghana.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you. Maybe we'll hear from you again. Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. You know that little thing that you were just doing, Jimmy, how we came out of Africa and then you lose the melanin? I wonder, because human history is really long, I wonder if there's any like white people, they got all white and then their tribe or whatnot moved south and then they started getting the melanin again. You think there's anybody like that?
I'm not familiar with that. I can't rule it out that it would happen, but what tends to happen with lighter skinned people when they go into areas that have more intense sunlight is they just burn.
Yeah.
And they get suntanned. Yeah. And suntan actually can happen with darker skinned people too. Even if someone is a sub-Saharan African, if they spend more time in the sun, their skin's going to get darker.
Right.
And if they spend more time in an office building, their skin will get lighter. So tanning is a universal human phenomenon. But typically what happens with genetics is a use it or lose it strategy, because we build up over the course of time genes that will produce a particular effect. And if we aren't using those genes, if they're not performing a useful function, then they will tend to erode over time. And so that's how people lost in Northern Europe. That's how they lost their melanin. They originally had genes that had developed in Africa that were making melanin in their skin. But then when they moved to Northern Europe, that became a disadvantage.
Yeah,
and so
right.
the genes that made melanin started to deteriorate, and they broke. They got to the point where they were no longer making that much melanin, which was a good thing, and it promoted the survival value of the offspring because now they could make the vitamin D they needed in a Northern European climate. But the thing is that once genes degrade, it is not likely that they will go
come back. Oh, yeah, right.
Because there's not like okay, how do we repair this broken code here? It can, a feature can re-evolve, but it's not as easy as just going back and fixing the thing that eroded.
Ah, that makes sense. All right.